Do you know the real truth in the New Testament about the story of the woman who was caught in the act of adultery?
Have you ever wondered what Yeshua bent down and began to write in the sand?
Well, let's take a look at this story. Here we are. Yeshua is in Jerusalem. Things have been stirred up, so to speak. And this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, that should raise some eyebrows. First of all, poor thing, how embarrassing. But let me tell you what was going on in first century Israel. First century Israel, the Romans had occupied the land. They were brutal, they were mean. As a matter of fact, the Roman soldiers that were sent to Jerusalem came from the prisons in Rome. If you were a prisoner in Rome and you said, yeah, I volunteered to go and govern the land of Israel, you got your prison sentence commuted. So let's just put it nicely. Those soldiers were not nice. And the priesthood, now the Sadducees, we're not talking about the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Zealots, the Essenes. We're only talking about the Sadducees who ran the temple. Right. That sect of priesthood was known to be the meanest, cruelest group of priests ever on the face of the earth, even today. Okay, moving right along. And so what would happen, they were in cahoots with the Romans. They would make sure that they had tax collectors, the Sadducees. They would help the Romans select the ones who would be tax collectors. Right. The tax collectors would then pay a percentage to the Sadducees and then the rest to the Romans. The Sadducees had all the nice clothes, drove all the great cars, had all the nice clothes, the good houses. They had all the luxuries of the land, and they were in cahoots with the Romans. And so the Sadducees would do this. They would see an Israeli woman that they were interested in, and they would go to her and say, you're going to be in the temple to service the men, and if you refuse, then your property will be confiscated. Your family will be sold into slavery. You will be sent to Rome. Or worse, your whole family will be killed and we're going to take you anyway.
It's interesting that we don't understand the background and the context of these scriptures. And so we read this story and we just put it into modern day terms and texts without understanding what really was happening. The priesthood in the time of Yeshua was so corrupt.
Sadducees.
Yes. And he had come to restore some truth to that and help people understand what was really happening.
Well, we have it right here in John chapter 8. And in verse 7 it says this, that Yeshua turned to those Sadducees, and here's this woman, she's probably barely covered, bless her heart. And he says to them, hey dudes, you without sin, go ahead and stone her, because according to Torah, if you were guilty of that, you had to kill the woman. Well, did they stone her? They dropped their rocks. Why did they drop their rocks? Because every one of them was guilty of committing adultery with her. What she chose was this: okay, I'll go in and service you men because I don't want my family to be killed. I don't want my family to be sold in slavery, and I don't want the property confiscated, and I have no lineage here in the land. She was thinking about the welfare of her family. I wonder, if I was there, what decision would I have made? What about you? Make a comment. Do you blame this lady? I mean, do you look at her like she was just a immoral woman? There's more to the story. And so he asks them, all those without you, go ahead, without sin. In other words, those of you who didn't take advantage of this woman, throw a rock at her. They drop their stones, and then something else happens. What is that?
Oh, it's so interesting because they were coming to accuse him so they could catch him in a trap. And Yeshua doesn't respond to them in this way. In other words, the very thing that they're trying to trap him in, Yeshua, by writing in the sand, brings that accusation back to them, and they are accused of the wrong. And what he is doing is writing in the sand a scripture, because remember, in those days, they didn't have the New Testament to read.
That's right. And it says in John chapter 8, verse 8, that he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Ever wondered what in the world he wrote? I mean, here we are. This woman's barely clothed. These guys are going to kill her. And he stoops down to write something? What did he write?
And so he is writing on the ground a scripture from Torah that these men knew very well. The scripture is found in Jeremiah 17, verse 13. And let me read you this scripture. So these men are looking, and he is writing in something in the sand, and they are looking to see what he's writing. And this is the scripture. Lord, you are Israel's hope. All who abandon you will be put to shame. They will disappear like names written in the sand, because they have abandoned you, the Lord, the spring of living water.
Well, it says it right there. And they all just, don't you know, I would have loved to see the look on their faces as they were running away, because then he turns to her and says, where are your accusers? Mm-hmm. And then he says something so important. Mm-hmm. He said, is no one condemning you? And he said, neither do I condemn you. God is saying that to this woman. Because don't you know, she's filled with guilt, filled with shame, been abused and hurt, and talk about reputation destroyed. Right. He says, go and sin no more. Now, that is biblical language for this. Next time, my dear, let them kill you. Don't allow anyone to abuse you like that. And the scene ends, and the focus should have turned to the hypocrisy of the religious leaders rather than to the sacrifice of this beautiful, precious woman. You can relate to this, I'm sure some of you, hopefully not fully. But if you've been in this place in your life, we would love to know how you have come to the place of your reputation and your dignity being restored. Or maybe you could just say, I can relate to this.
I remember a time when we were in Israel, and we had a rabbi following our group around because we were so unusual. We weren't going to the normal Christian sites. We were doing the authentic things and teaching our group the true identity of Israel. And he came in front of our group and began to ask us. He was stroking his beard. Do you remember that, Yana?
I so remember it.
He was stroking his beard, and he was trying to formulate the right questions to ask us, to trap us in what we were teaching the people about their true identity of being Israel. And finally, he couldn't trap us in our answers, because everything that we were speaking back to him and answering to him was the truth from the Old Testament perspective, and he couldn't trap us and point his finger at us. Finally, he did one last stroke of his beard. He put his hands down to his side, dropped his head, and walked away, just like these Sadducees did that day.
Well, the story is a good story because it ends with a woman being recovered and the religious leadership that was corrupt. Now, remember, not all religious leadership was corrupt.
Right.
Just this stream. And he dealt with them really, really well. And that's a happy thing, because people who are in leadership positions really are supposed to be the ones that have the strongest heart for the people. Mm-hmm. Now, that's just the way the story goes. It's so important to know the truth and the background. So I've got a question for you. Have you ever lost your reputation? And if so, have you wondered How in the world are you going to get that reputation back? Well, we're going to answer that for you in the very next teaching.